11:31, so we should get started. We've had a good turnout for the webinar series thus far, so people aren't completely burned out on Zoom yet. And we've had a good mix of farmers and policy folks and various representatives from the industry. And I see people are continuing to log in now. So welcome back everyone to our dairy webinar series. And as I mentioned last Friday, we are going to be focused on greenhouse gas emissions and life cycle assessment of organic dairies in particular, but many of the principles and items that will be discussed, of course, are broadly applicable, I'm sure, to all dairy in our small little state here in Vermont. And for André and Horacio, this is, as you know, probably in your respective states too, a pretty hot topic right now. We have a new climate law that's been put into place in Vermont, and there are, upcoming expectations that the ag industry will be reducing emissions by 40% across the entire industry here in Vermont. So we need to learn. We need to understand what some of our options are and what's going on with greenhouse gas emissions on dairy. So thank you so much for taking the time today to provide us some education on the topic, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from us again in the future. So welcome, André Brito. I think many of you have heard from André before. He's presented at a number of our conferences and regional events. He's a professor at the University of New Hampshire, right close by here. And today is going to be talking about seaweed feeding and greenhouse gas mitigation. And after André, Horacio Aguirre, so awful. Not bad, not even good. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, my alma mater. You can't see, I have a badger up on the shelf back there. I'll bust out Bucky here in a minute. But from UW-Madison, has been working on life cycle assessment on lots of different types of farms, but recently on a project, I believe, with Organic Valley and some farmers here in Vermont, looking at LCA assessment here. So it'll be exciting to hear about some of those results. And just so folks know, we keep ourselves on mute. Type your questions into the chat and we'll try to get as many of those answered as possible. And we will have CCA credits here at the end of the meeting. So André, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Can you guys hear me well there? I guess the answer is yes. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Heather, for the invitation, for participating in this. It's always very good to participate in these events. Hopefully next year will be in person. I'm missing, the Organic Dairy Conference there in Vermont. So I'll be talking about here some broad aspects of feeding seaweed to organic dairy cows, but mostly focus on methane and the potential of those seaweeds. That's the outline of the presentation. I'll talk a little bit about the enteric methane production, some terminology, general greenhouse gas emissions. I know that Horacio would be also showing some more of that. I will not take that time. Seaweed species use in livestock diets, and then more specific about some of the seaweeds has been fed. There's some data, emerging data, some are locally available, some are not. I'll be discussing that, and also even talking about kelp, which is heavily utilized in organic dairies. And then some conclusions and questions. Just to start, I'll be talking a lot about methane production, methane yield, methane intensity, just to define those terms here up front. So when I'm referring to methane production, that's the absolute amount of methane produced by animal, and I'm using here grams per day. It's the kind of the unit that is being used. Methane yield is grams of methane per kilogram of dry matter intake or feed intake, right? And then methane intensity is grams of methane per kilogram of NH-corrected milk, right? And just a quick example here, we should be looking at this calculations. Let's say a cow A here, she's producing about 500 grams per day of methane. She's consuming a lot of feed here at 30 kilos and producing lots of milk, 45 kilos of NH-corrected milk. So the methane yield of that cow would be about 17 grams per kilo of DMI, the intensity 11.1, right? However, if you look at the cow B, it's the same amount of methane, same production of methane, but now she's eating less and producing less milk. So what happened here is that methane yield goes up about 20% and methane intensity goes up about 29%. So in this case, this cow overall, she's less efficient, right? Because per kilogram or per pound of product, she's emitting more methane. That's how I'll be going back to some of this terminology, and I'll also be using methane interchangeably with CH4 across this presentation. So be aware of that as well. So just getting to the aspect of how methane is formed. Maybe I know that most of the folks are familiar with this, but maybe some are not necessarily. So the ruminants, they have this one stomach with 4 compartments, and it's indicated there. So where you have the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. So a lot of the methane is basically produced here in the rumen, which is the first and the largest compartment of ruminants, right, of the stomach of the ruminants. The abomasum is equivalent to our stomach, the human stomach, which is a gastric, we'll see the gastric stomach, and is basically have a low pH and digestion of proteins mostly there. Again, just to see how big the rumen is, right, all the left side of the animal. And again, have billions of microorganisms there, including those that digest fiber, those that digest proteins and utilize fat. And also there is a group of microbes that produce methane. So, and just for context, you can see the heart right here, right? So, and then the rumen, all that left side of the animal. So these microbes will produce, some of them produce methane. So it's a natural process, right? But it has been causing some issues that we'll be discussing as we move along. So in terms of the rumen fermentation processes, and I'll show here how methane is actually formed. Again, if the animal is consuming feed, right, and it could be a forage source or a grain source, you basically have two major groups of nutrients, right? The fiber or the carbohydrates or the structural carbohydrates, and the starch, right, is more energy, provides more energy than fiber. The microbes will attack and start to decompose, to degrade some of those structure and non-structural carbohydrates. They release glucose, and another set of microbes start to utilize glucose for their own energy purpose and for growth. They produce what we call microbial protein, which is the major source of amino acids to those animals. But also fermentation of glucose produce gases, right? And you have gases like hydrogen, CO2, and methane. And hydrogen and CO2 are the substrate for the methanogens or the microbes to produce methane. In addition to that, just part of the metabolism of the animal, there is also production of what we call volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, and those are the acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Those are the energy source for the animal. It gets absorbed. Acetate is used to produce fat in the mammary gland, right? And milk fat. Propionate is used to produce glucose, so the animals can also produce milk, and butyrate is also used to make fat. So you can see how the fermentation is, and the methane is kind of the byproduct of this process. And I'll go back to some of this as we move along. One thing we need to make sure is 95% of the methane comes out via burps, right? Not to the other end. So make that clear here, because again, all this metabolism takes place in the ruminants. A little bit of that happening in the large intestine of the animal, but it's much smaller compartment in the ruminant, that huge compartment that produce lots of methane. Why we're interested in methane? Well, we know that methane has been implicated and contributing with the climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. We know also that methane is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide, for instance. So yes, it can cause some of the issues that we have seen in terms of climate change, right? And also why you should be looking at methane is this is data, recent data from US EPA, right? You can see that enteric fermentation, exactly those processes that I just mentioned, is the second largest source of methane in the United States. When you combine enteric fermentation with manure management, right? So it becomes then the first source, right, of methane emissions in the US. So that's why methane should be looking at. And another aspect that's interesting about methane is about the methane half-life. So that means how long methane stays in the atmosphere. It's short-lived, it's only 10 years, right? So this is good because any mitigation strategy to reduce methane would have a more direct impact and faster impact, right? And methane doesn't hang in there for too long. Just for comparison, carbon dioxide, let's say the car that you turn on today and emit CO2, that same CO2 will stay in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. So nitrous oxide is 110 years. That comes a lot from crop fertilization with nitrogen, right? Emit some nitrous oxide, stay there for 110 years. Methane is only 10 years, but while it's there, it can cause some damage and some of the implications of, in terms of the greenhouse gases, right? So, but this is a great opportunity because it's just staying in the atmosphere for 10 years. And another aspect I want to show here, because oftentimes agriculture has been linked to or has been blamed, right, for all these greenhouse gas emissions. But we know that carbon dioxide, again, this is data from EPA's, is responsible for 80%, right? Sorry, 80% of the US greenhouse gas emissions is basically carbon dioxide, 10% in methane, right? So it's much shorter, right? And when you look by sector, you can see that agriculture is responsible for 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. That includes CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Even though there is a picture of a cow here, right? This is not only animal agriculture, right? Somewhat misleading because it is also crop production that also within that 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But you can see all the rest mostly is coming from fossil fuels, right? So again, still, I think it's still important to look into methane. How we measure methane, there is different ways to do that. I think it's important to mention this here. There is this respiratory chambers where you have animals, as you can see here, inside of these chambers, and basically it captures all the gases, right? In this case, burps and farts, and it's considered the gold standard because you can capture all the gases of the animals. Of course, there is some limitations here, mostly related to feed intake, right? So if the animals are in those chambers, you can reduce feed intake, so potentially you can produce less methane. So if you're testing different diets, that could be somewhat biased. However, animals are here for a few days only, right? So and some of these issues, you know, these are not long-term there, but still, right, there is some issues related to animal changing animal behavior and things like that. But that's considered the gold standard. So we have been using at UNH a lot of this system here. The commercial name is Green Feed. where the cows will be visiting a unit, as you can see here, and the cows wearing our RFID ear tag that trigger the system. It releases some feed like pellets, and while the cows are there consuming that feed, so there are sensors, right, that and sample flow measurements that can actually analyze methane, right? So of course, this kind of system, this is another setup. So the animals, you can take several samples. These are spot samples, but you can take a lot of those samples over time. The animals can express the natural behaviors because once they're trained to visit the unit, they know that there's feed there. They visit these 4 or 5 times a day, right? So, and you can take multiple measurements over multiple days. Here's the grazing setup of the system. We have been using this also on the cows on the pasture. So we have the solar panels here, and we move the system with cows every milking, right? So, and the cows can have access, and you can take methane measurements. There is this system here that we have been using in the past. This was which is called the hexafluoride tracer technique. It used to be one of the most used systems, but with the green feed, I think it takes some of that, some of these measurements away. But basically, what you see the tubing here that goes up to the nostrils of the cows and basically capture the gas, and then the gas gets on this reserve here in the canisters, and then you can take a sample by basically plugging a needle here, a syringe, and take a sample, and then you analyze for methane. So again, there is this way also the animals can move around. Of course, it's more complicated here because of this equipment and this backpack in the cows. It's sometimes more, it's a lot of missing samples and equipment issues sometimes. We have not been using this anymore since the green feed came to the picture. Okay, so I think I kind of covered a little bit about the methane production, the greenhouse gas emissions. I'll start now moving forward towards talking a little bit about the seaweed species. You know, seaweeds basically are macroalgae, right? They have different shapes, size, colors, composition. There are over 10,000 species of seaweeds out there, but only a few of them has been used in animal agriculture, and I'll highlight some of them here today. There is brown, red, and green algae that has been used. As you probably know, they concentrate a lot of minerals from the seawater, including iodine. They typically have up to 20 times more minerals than typical land plants, right? And they have been using for livestock for thousands of years. You know, there are reports of sheep being grazing this, even sometimes stored as a silage. A lot of the seaweeds, they contain bioactive compounds, including fluorotannins that's similar to the terrestrial tannins, but it also have bromoforms. And I'll, again, going back to some of this bioactive compounds later on. So this kind of a list of different types of seaweeds that are out there that has been more used in animal agriculture. There are some of the ones that I'll be showing here today that's not in this list. They are more kind of novel seaweeds, but for sure, Ascophyllum or Scophylum nodosum, which is the kelp meal, right? That is heavily commercialized here in the Northeast and across the US and used quite a lot in the organic dairies. For sure, the one that has been more studies on, not only in terms of methane, very little studies on methane, but a lot of studies on animal health and things like that, right? So that's for sure the most studied seaweed species out there. Another aspect I want to mention here, if you want to, you know, actually implement or develop this concept of seaweeds, of course, there is some pathways that has been proposed here where we have to start with a foundational research, right? So trying to identify those seaweeds that are promising, follow up with animal trials, to see viability, effects on production, sensory properties in milk and meat and things like that. Then move on to more like industrial application of the seaweed, and then and that includes harvesting, right, processing, distribution, and finally also look at all the implications, right? So and this includes is seaweed farming even feasible? It can reduce emissions or can be associated improving carbon sequestration. On the livestock farming side of things, can reduce or not methane, can improve feed utilization. So there's a lot of questions related to that to make this happen, and or even if it's possible to make that happen, right? Yes, I covered production of methane. I covered a little bit now about the seaweed species, and now I'll focus on a couple of species here as we move along. Specifically, this red seaweed, Asparagopsis taxiforms, looking at some data on performance and methane emissions right now. So, as I said, there is this growing interest on feeding seaweed to dairy cows and ruminants in general, including beef. In vitro work with this specifically species here, the Asparagopsis taxiforms, that it was initially some of this research emerged in Australia, and some of this lab, right, in vitro work that basically simulates the rumen of the cow in bottles, right? So show reductions of up to 99% in methane emissions. There is studies done in vivo with actual animals like beef cattle in UC Davis and also at Penn State that show substantial reduction in methane emissions, and that's where I will concentrate now. Just to have an idea about the chemical, the nutritional composition of the seaweeds, I think it's about 15% crude protein, 18% fiber. Not surprising here, that's a lot of ash or minerals, like 55%. Again, it concentrates a lot of those minerals. Calcium is relatively high, actually high in calcium, 3.3%, a little bit low in phosphorus, but you can see it's a lot of minerals and variable levels of crude protein and NDF, and I'll compare it to the other ones that I'll be showing here later. And this is the first study I will share here. This study was done at Penn State. It's one of the few studies, actually the only one, I think, that have been published with dairy cows, and this was done in Alex Hirstov lab at Penn State. And the first thing that's important to see feasibility of feeding seaweeds is the impacts on feed intake and milk production, right? The bottom line here, if something drop milk production or drop milk components, then it's more difficult to be applicable, right? So in this study, they fed 3 levels of the seaweed, of the Asparagopsis at control diet, no seaweed at 0.25% and 0.5% in the diet, very low levels. They did not see any negative impact on milk components like milk fat or milk protein percentage, even and did not change MUN. However, intake dropped quite a lot and milk production dropped quite a lot. So intake dropped about 4 pounds and milk production about 6 pounds when you compare the diet with 0% of the red seaweed versus the 0.5% inclusion. The 0.25% inclusion didn't change much compared to the 0%, right? So, of course, that is a concern if you talk about application, right? The production of fat also dropped statistically, and the milk protein also dropped statistically, right, in pounds per day. One thing that interesting, you don't see much of this is it's like this sensory panels, right, or taste panels, and they did this in this study. What's very nice, well, basically have a panel with 109 participants, and 43% of those participants, showing here in the blue were able to identify that the milk was coming from the cows that get seaweed. The authors didn't expand too much on that. They'll say if they dislike or like, I don't have that information, but it's basically we're able to identify, 43 out of 109 or 39%, even though this was not statistically significant, but was close, right? But get an indication here that it may affect the taste of milk, but I don't know if in a negative or in a positive way, but certainly, 43%, 39% of the folks are able to identify that milk. Again, that's very nice when you're talking about expanding this to, to the consumers, right? So now looking at methane, and this table shows that methane production, methane yield, and methane intensity. You can see that there was a reduction, very clear here in methane. So methane production, reduction of 34%, methane yield, a reduction of 29%, and methane intensity, again, grams of methane per kilogram of product of energy-corrected milk dropped by 26%. So so there is potential there for sure when you're talking about methane emissions reduction, right? So with this seaweed, right? But of course, there are some limitations that I just discussed, but it is effective to reduce methane. So another thing they look at, I think is important, is this seaweed, let's say over time, that response persists, or the microbes in the rumen can adapt, right? And then it loses its potency over time. They also look this in this study, and you can see here period 1, 2, 3, and 4. That refers to every 21 days difference here as the study progress, right? So every 21 days, so up to over 60 days of the study. And you can see in the first 242 days or so of the study, you can see there's this big drop in methane yield, right? That's grams of methane per kilogram of dry matter intake or feed intake. However, on the periods 3 and 4, it seems, right, that you see the data here, you don't have that same effect. So indicating that either maybe the microbes adapt to this compound, which the active compound is the bromoform, or maybe not, or maybe the concentration of bromophore change over time, right? And that's what they actually determine, right? So you can see here on this data, they did the same study. They basically store the seaweed up to 120 days, either on a dark or exposed to light. And you can see that and here in the y-axis, the concentration of bromoform, and you can see that the concentration drops over time. So that means that that's another limitation of the seaweed, even though it was effective to reduce methane, but it seems that the concentration of bromoform weakens over time, right? So it's less bromoform, so it's basically more specifically if you have light on it, exposed to light. So that kind of information is very important, because if you think about application this on the farm level, all of those needs to be considered, right? And then there is another study that was done. This was done with beef cattle at UC Davis. And again, this is the 2 studies that were done here in the US using this Asparagopsis taxiform seaweed. This is the layout of the experiment. Again, this was a beef study where they have animals in a high forage diet initially, and then these animals went to the mid forage diet, and then a low forage diet, basically during the finishing phase. And every 3 weeks, they measured methane, right? So, and these animals were in the study for 147 days, kind of long-term response. Again, for everything that you have to implement, we need to make sure that it affects intake, it's affecting, in this case of beef cattle feed efficiency, weight gain. That's very important to look at. So what they saw is the total body weight gain, the average daily weight gain, and the carcass weight was not statistically different between the diet with no seaweed and with 0.5% of seaweed. So that's good, right? It doesn't change the metrics that the farmers need to make money. Intake in this case was similar to the previous study with the dairy cattle. Intake dropped, right, about 3 pounds here. But what's interesting in this study, even though intake dropped, right, daily gain did not change, right? So feed efficiency went up, which is a good thing, right? So the animals are more efficient to convert feed, right, the energy from feed into the product, right, which is basically the weight gain, the average daily weight gain. So I see that as a positive aspect. When you're talking about methane emissions, what's interesting in this study, it was very efficient to reduce methane. Again, a 60% reduction when comparing the diet with 0 and 0.5% of the seaweed in the diet, and kind of low amount in the diet. 68% reduction in methane yield, right? And then a 73% reduction in methane intensity, right? In grams of methane, in this case, per kilogram of average daily weight gain, right? So again, this is of course promising. They did not see that same effect of changing bromoform concentration as the study progressed. So that means that there is a variation in those bromoform compounds from different batch or source of the same species. And again, this requires more studies. And they also look at this not only in the carcass quality, but also the sensory properties, like kind of the taste, the odor, right? It encompasses all of those of the meat, which is, again, is very nice to see this in this kind of study. So the rib eye area was exactly the same in inches, square inches here. So again, that's good. And then the consumer panel look at tenderness, juiciness, flavor, and the overall, and have a and basically grade the rank between 1 and 9, 1 that they hated and 9 that they love it. So on average, you see that the rank was around 6, 6.5, and there is no, it was not statistically different. So in other words, the seaweed is not having a negative impact on the taste, right? On the sensory properties of the meat, which again is a positive thing. I already mentioned about some limitations of the seaweed, but there is other limitations that specifically to the Asparagopsis taxiformis is that it's not available locally, right? At this point, it's expensive because it's, at this point, even though things are changing, it's wild harvested. But again, there is groups already working on basically develop aquaculture systems for this seaweed. There's some concerns in terms of bromides and iodine concentration being transferred to milk, even though in that study that I mentioned, this was not necessarily corroborated. It's an invasive species, so need to be very careful for that, because if you transfer a seaweed for other ecosystem, then you can cause another problem, right? And also low biomass production also. So to scale up, right, it may be more difficult. So again, we covered the methane production, the seaweed species, covered the tax forms, and now I would like to talk about the Chondrus crispus, is another seaweed, and we have done some studies with this seaweed here at UNH and also Wolf's Neck Center. So why are you looking at Chondrus crispus? Mostly because it's a red seaweed like the Asparagopsis, but it's locally available, right? It's here in the Gulf of Maine. There is some in vitro working showing that substantial methane suppression with the seaweed in vitro with very small amounts. There is also some minerals and bioactive compounds. It's just the composition of the seaweed, as you can see. Again, the crude protein was lower if you compare it to Asparagopsis, then the F was a little bit higher, more fiber. Ash kind of, again, it concentrates a lot. That's the minerals. That's about almost like 40%. and iodine is about 400 milligrams per kilo ppms, which is a little bit lower than what you see in kelp meal. The first study was done here at UNH. So we fed 3 levels of the seaweed at 0%, 3% inclusion, or 6% inclusion. As you can see, much higher levels compared to the other seaweed, the Asparagopsis, right? And again, we look at some of the same metrics. Dry matter intake reduced in a linear fashion, as you can see here, from 43.7 to 40.3. This is our Jersey cows. However, because milk production was maintained and energy corrected milk was maintained, so feed efficiency has a tendency to improve, right? If you reduce intake and you maintain or improve production, so your feed efficiency goes up. In this case, it's a little bit, was not statistically significant, but has a tendency to improve feed efficiency. And there is no effects on negative effects on milk fat or milk protein, which is, again, is a good thing, right? When you look at methane, then it's not too encouraging to use the seaweed. So methane production dropped for about 8%. Remember, the other seaweed dropped on average to about 30%. So it's much lower response here. And there is no change in methane intensity and no change in methane yield, right? Which again, it kind of limits a little bit the use of the seaweed. What we think that dropped methane then was basically intake. There is this very positive relationship between feed intake and methane production. So in other words, as you increase intake, more fermentation happens, more gas production, right? And this equation shows this very well here. In a sense, right, in addition to methane being a greenhouse gas, is also indicates energy loss for the animal, right? That's why it's another reason to try to reduce methane, because all methane that's lost indicates that energy loss of methane is not being used to milk production. But you can see that that can explain our data, because intake drop, then methane also drop without affecting the intensity and yield. We also like to see both going down as well. We did, using the same species, we did a study at Wolf's Neck Center. This we used 22 cows. These are crossbred cows and Holsteins. So we look at milk production. In this case, we're just feeding either 0 chondrus or 6% in the diet. And we measured, it was a continuous design, we follow up to 9 weeks. And you can see that chondrus milk production was a little bit lower, but not statistically different, right? Statistically, they're the same, but as you can see, there's a little bit lower milk production. So when you look at milk components, so no change in milk fat percentage and milk protein percentage. However, production of milk fat yield, the production drop on the chondrus diet, and also milk protein drop here in the chondrus diet. So of course, it's something that we don't want to happen. And then methane production, in this case, was a bit more encouraging than the study that was done at UNH. Methane production dropped for about 15%. As you can see here, the blue bar is the control, no seaweed diet, and the orange bar is the chondrus diet. You can see that overall methane drop. Unfortunately, we did not measure intake in this study just because of the setup of the experiment at Wolf's Neck. But that's an indication that you have about 15% reduction with a seaweed that's locally available, right? On the other hand, we did not see any effect of methane intensity, which is grams of methane per kilogram of energy corrected milk, which again, even though we didn't measure intake, but that kind of let us think that this response was probably linked to intake. So methane production dropped, probably because feed intake dropped, even though again, we did not measure intake in this study. So we cover several aspects here from climate change, seaweed species, asparagopsis, we cover the Chondrus crispus, and now to finalize, which is a seaweed that's more common, way more common than Chondrus, right? Which is kelp with the species of Scophilodose. And we did a couple of studies looking at methane, and I'll share in a minute. So a Scophilus is a brown seaweed. I have been talking about red seaweeds. Scophilus or kelp meal is a brown one. It's high in iodine, wide spectrum of nutritional compounds, and has polyunsaturated fatty acids, polyphenols, bioactive peptides, vitamins. Is rich in this compound right here is the fluorotannins, very similar to terrestrial tannins that you're going to see, for instance, in legumes like bird's-foot trefoil. The only difference this is on seaweeds. And it's well known that tannins, and including fluorotannins, they have antimicrobial properties. So we thought that because of that, it could, right, change some of the microbes that produce methane, and reducing them, you could see an effect on methane emissions. And some in vitro study done in the lab settings saw that. So we try to do this and see if it happens in actual cows. We know that kelp is heavily used in the Northeast. 59% of organic dairies is feeding in the Midwest, up to 83%, like Minnesota. There's a survey, Heather participate as well, actually worked together on that survey. 73% of the grass-fed organic dairies feed kelp across the US. So again, it's heavily utilized. We did a study in 2015 or so, a grazing trial, and part of the grazing study, we did measure methane using that equipment that I showed earlier. And his methane production over time, in July, August, and September, we saw a drop of about 10% in methane production in July, but again, we did not see any change in either the following months, kind of indicating maybe adaptation of the rumen microbes to those fluorotannins. We really don't know. Then when you look at methane yield and methane intensity over time, those were not changed, right? So again, doesn't seem that is a viable, kelp is a viable strategy to mitigate methane. We did another study, this is a winter trial this time, and we feed a lot of kelp. Again, I will not recommend feed this amount at all. Remember here, we feed about 4 ounces, which is within recommendations by the industry. But in this case, we feed 14 ounces based on some of in vitro data, again, lab data that show that methane was reduced with higher levels of kelp. So as you can see, in the period 1, it was about 3 weeks feeding that, we'd see no change in methane whatsoever, methane production. We then drop to 3.5 ounces and still don't see anything. And then we basically feed no kelp in period 3 of the study, again, every 21 days. And again, obviously in this case, basically went back to the baseline. So this kind of reinforced that kelp is not, probably not involved. Of course, more studies still need to be done, but probably not associated with any meaningful change in methane emissions. Just to summarize here, I think it hits my time. I show data that studies done with dairy cattle, dairy cows, that red seaweed, that the asparagopsis taxiform did decrease methane production up to 34%, right? But at the expense of dry matter intake and production of milk and milk fat and protein, right? In beef was more promising because it depressed methane production by almost like 6 to 7%, improved feed efficiency, maintained body and carcass weight, daily gain, and meat sensory properties, the taste and everything was not affected, right? With Chondrus crispus, which is this red seaweed locally available, we saw suppression ranging from 9 up to 15% in 2 trials. No negative effects on milk production, but intake decrease in study 1 that was done at UNH, and production of milk fat and milk protein decrease in the study 2 that was done at Wolf's Neck, right? And to finalize, kelp milk showing consistent effects during the grazing season. It dropped early in the season, but had no effect as the season progressed. And during the winter season, it did not change, even feeding very high levels. So it doesn't seem to be a solution at this point. So with that, there's some acknowledgement here, the funding source of the project, and also thanks Heather again for the invitation. And I will open up some questions. I think I hit my.
Hey, thanks, Andre. Yeah, we'll take a few questions and then move on to the next presentation. Andre does have to leave a little early, so if you have a question for him now, please type it in. There's one question: does feeding seaweed impact the taste of the cow milk?
Yeah, I think that was the answer. I think maybe this question came before.
Yes, yeah, that was the first
one. Well, it seems, you know, that on the beef end, it didn't affect anything. On the milk aspect, 39% of the participants were able to identify, right, there was milk coming from seaweed, but was not statistically significant. So I guess overall, with that small level that is being fed about 0.5%, it seems that will not have detrimental effects on acceptance of that milk, which is a good thing.
Yeah. Any other questions folks have for Andre before we turn it over to Horacio? Andre, I just had a quick question. What's your gut feeling on this? Is this going to be part of our management in the future with, you know, sort of requirements to reduce emissions, or do you think we have other options?
I think there's more direct options, and to be honest, I think when you think about just forage quality and management, right? That includes better animal health and some folks mentioning genetics. I think you may achieve what you call a reduction in methane intensity, right? Yeah. So it's methane per product. I think the seaweed is an emerging field. I feel that I think we need to do this kind of research and check viability, right? So, but never forget that the basics are always
right.
The best.
No silver bullets. No
exactly.
Silver bullets.
The grazing management, high quality forage has been shown over and over that you drop methane per kilogram of product.
Great. We do have Glinda joining us next week, so we can also save this question for her. But anything about genetics and methane, you know, using genetics, any genetic differences?
Yeah, I think there are studies been going on trying to identify animals that emit less, right? And strains of cattle that basically are emitting less methane, and you could potentially select for that. I think there is studies done in this direction, and probably going to see more of that coming in.
Great. All right, one last question. Does grain increase or decrease methane intensity?
Well, grain, you know, because when you feed grain, specifically starch-based grain, usually you have more production of propionate in the rumen, right? One of those volatile fatty acids that I mentioned initially, which is a hydrogen sink. In other words, in the pathway, it removes hydrogens from the rumen, so there is less hydrogen available for the methanogens, the microbes that make methane, to make methane. So generally, grains will reduce methane production potentially, but certainly methane intensity, because you also produce more milk, right? So, and then more milk, so the amount of methane per kilogram or per pound of milk then is less. So intensity oftentimes will drop when you have more grain diets.
All right. Well, I think we'll end on that question. And Horacio, if you're ready, we'll turn it over to you. Andre, thank you so much.
Well,
we'll
thank
be
you,
in
guys.
touch soon. And Andre's also part of an e-organic webinar coming up as well, talking more about emissions. And that's in March, next week, maybe. So thank you. Horacio, we'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather. Can you see my screen? Oh, cool.
Looks great.
You can hear me fine. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for staying and for attending today's seminar. My name is Horacio Aguirre. I am a scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the BSc Biological Systems Engineer Department. And I've been working the last decade or more in LCA, life cycle assessment, studies of different systems, mostly related to agriculture and dairy, and some other also integrating energy, production of renewable energy in agricultural systems. But with the end of, first establishing a baseline of the emissions and then trying to identify what management practices or what practices can be adopted to mitigate overall greenhouse gas emissions at the product level, in this case, milk. So I'm going to present today the results, preliminary results, where they're under review. Hopefully they'll be available soon, of a large study that we conducted with Organic Valley in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts. So I'm the presenter today, but it's an effort of many people at UW-Madison, Becky Larson, who's connected here, Michelle Wattier in Silva, and also Nicole from Organic Valley, who probably you know her. So a little bit of the background. We partnered with Organic Valley here. They are present in all the United States, based on their, their presence and their farms. And climatic conditions of the United States, we kind of like separated or divided the United States in 8 regions. And today I'm going to present the results from 4 regions. And then, I mean, Organic Valley is a very important, cooperative. They account for more than 50% of the farms in the US. So the practices that they were able to provide and identify are very representative of organic practices in the US. So as you probably know, they have very clear carbon neutrality goals. They want to achieve carbon neutrality as a big chunk of the dairy industry. There is a goal by 2050 to become carbon neutral, with different degrees of reductions, to 15% by 2030, 30% by 2035. But in order to do this, and in order to measure, to capture the reduction, we need to establish a baseline. So what are we starting with? So that's how this study started. Basically 2 phases. The phase 1, which concluded already, and I'm going to present. We evaluated greenhouse gas emissions, but also other environmental impacts, land use, fossil fuel use, water use, eutrophication potential, and we modeled 4 regions: the Midwest and Great Lakes, New England, California, and the Northwest. And also we defined different multiple farm layouts representative of these regions. And today I'm going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions and on these 4 regions. And we're starting a second phase this year, actually, to complete the other 4 regions of the United States, the same environmental impacts, but also to assess further mitigation practices and identify which are the most effective, to bring down emissions and other environmental impacts. And also something that we want to do here is evaluate the impact of, the modelers' decisions on results. So, like André presented, there are multiple equations, one related to dry matter intake that just relates, dry matter intake content to methane emissions. But there are other equations out there that relate other components of the diet in order to capture enteric methane emissions. So there are multiple equations, multiple tools out there, so that choosing the right one is a decision from the LCA modeler that affects results, or like the decision of allocation or functional unit. Is energy corrected milk, the right one to really evaluate the intensity, or should you consider other functional units? Anyway, we use life cycle assessment as our methodology. Probably you heard about this method, but it's become the most common and used method to quantify the environmental impacts and benefits of a product or a service, right, in a system. So it's being used widely in agriculture and energy production. There are 4 general steps or areas in LCA: goal and scope definition, inventory analysis, where you kind of like gather the data, impact assessment, and interpretation. So, like simple words, what an LCA does is it really keeps track of everything that happens since the extraction of raw materials that go into a product through the end of life of that product or service. That's usually a complete LCA goes from cradle to grave. But there are different system boundaries that can be applied. Like in this case, we use a cradle to gate to farm gate approach. So we're evaluating the impacts that happen at the farm level. In the scope and goal definition here are where all these assumptions that I was telling you about happen. What's the functional unit? The functional unit is the denominator that we're going to choose to present our results. And since it's the denominator, any change in that, it's going to significantly, affect the overall estimations. What are the system boundaries? What's the allocation? Allocation is a strategy used in LCA to assign environmental impacts or benefits to each product when there is a system producing more than one product. In this case, we have milk and meat that are produced. So in order to attribute environmental impacts to milk, we need to assign those also to meat because our system produces both products. So what strategy is used is important. Allocation, there's like system expansion, which is a more complex process, but usually the allocation ratios that are used consider like a mass relationship between the 2 products, or like an economic relationship. What's the price or the cost to produce each of these products? So these are all the assumptions that go into an LCA. And there's plenty of literature available. Like if you're interested in this method, you can go ahead and look for more out there, or you can send me an email. Of course, I'll be happy to discuss this with you. So going into our system itself, our system boundaries, like I mentioned before, are from cradle to farm gate. We're considering all the processes that went into manufacture the energy and materials that go into the farm. So there's like gypsum that's needed, there's bedding, there's gasoline, diesel, natural gas, etc., electricity that go into the farm that we need to consider. And all of these have embedded impacts associated with them. In this case, we're talking about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. We have the activities that happen at the farm, how the herd is managed, what's the composition of this herd, the animal types, etc., what's the composition of the milk, manure management, and how the crops, if they're produced on farm, they're produced off farm, they're imported. All these is going to have an impact. There was a question I remember before to André, like, is the transportation having a big impact? Where's the algae, like seaweed, coming from? Yes, it does. And as we're going to see, it does have an impact in the overall estimation of greenhouse gas emissions. I talk about this a little bit already. Functional unit is the common denominator of how we present our results. We are adopting the recommendations from the IDF International Dairy Federation, which is also adopted by most LCAs available out there, but there are other functional units that we can use. But this one is 1 kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk and corrected to 4% fat and 3.3% protein, which has become the standard more or less in milk LCAs. Allocation, in this case, we're using also an allocation between milk and meat, a decision based on energy feed and energy in the feed that partitions around 85 and 90% of the environmental impacts to milk. But there are other allocation ratios that can be used, like based on mass, on nutrients of milk and meat that we also evaluated. In terms of what we're studying, André did a pretty great job actually introducing what are greenhouse gas emissions, why it's important to keep track of them. So what we're including in this LCA, we're including methane, we're including N2O from our system boundaries, and also emissions of CO2 from fossil sources. We are not including CO2 from biotic sources. As you can see in this picture, we're considering that is part CO2 that is emitted from our system. Biotic CO2 is part of the carbon cycle. So it's been part of the dairy feed that the cows ate as CO2. Of course, when the cows start converting this carbon in methane, then that's outside of the carbon cycle. We're keeping track of that methane. And this CO2, these biotic CO2 emissions are different, right, than CO2 here in the right, emitted from fossil sources. We're taking carbon from the earth and we are putting it in the atmosphere, and there's no cycle. So where's the data coming from? There's a lot of data and assumptions behind an LCA, those that are familiar with that. Multiple sources, Organic Valley was able to provide key data for material and energy consumption quantities of their farms. Also in terms of management practices. For the estimation of emissions, we use different models like the IFSM integrated farm system model. We've been talking with André before, that's a pretty established model, and it's actually a very good one in terms of predicting greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts. But also we use IPCC factors for N2O, for example, emissions from manure application, and also databases, EcoInvent, and there's the United States Life Cycle Inventory database built into SimPro for keeping track of all those embedded emissions in the materials that we are using in farm, like the fertilizers that go into the farm, the bedding going to the farm, so the gypsum, all those things need to be manufactured, and that manufacturing processes those resulting in impacts as well. Crop yields, we're taking USDA, pasture, we're taking from Organic Valley based on their surveys, and crop yields other than pasture, we are using USDA data and averaging for past 5 years. Also, we have the environmental factors, temperature, rain, all that's going to affect the estimation of our emissions. So we are taking an approach of, for each region, this data is available at state level. So we gather that data, but we do a weighted average based on the number of farms that are available on that state in order to come up with a regional average. And then we have electricity and how the mix of the a megawatt of electricity in Vermont is not going to be the same as a megawatt in Wisconsin, where they have more coal and natural gas, versus Vermont, where you have more renewables. So this is there's a lot going on here, but I just wanted to give you an example of the assumptions and of the things that we need to keep track in order to define our scenarios. This is an example of the Midwest region. We're modeling 5 farms here. The first number here, 50, represents the number of lactating cows. So we have to add the maintenance animals. And then the type of animal, this one's Jersey, and then the others are each for Holsteins. And then there's any particular characteristic of a farm, then this here highlights that. For example, this farm, 50 H grass, has 50 lactating cows, is Holstein farm, and it's more relies more heavily on grass. And then we're also modeling Amish farms in the Midwest and New England. But just a key differences here, for example, Jersey cows, they are smaller animals, but they have higher fat and protein in the milk, which at the end is going to affect our results because we're corrected. Remember that functional unit is fat and protein, correct milk. So the higher the fat and the protein, which is the value of the milk, the higher that denominator and the lower the environmental, the greenhouse gas emissions at the end, the intensity. There are farms with bedded packs, which at the end are going these grass and Amish farms in the Midwest and New England, which is going to affect the N2 emissions mostly, which I'm going to explain later. But we also follow the diets, dry matter, not only dry matter intake, but for each animal type, like lactating cows, growing heifers, mature heifers, and dry cows. We have to do this because, as we see from the presentation before me, it really affects, for example, enteric methane. And then the CP content in the diet, crude protein, is going to affect how much nitrogen is excreted with the manure, and then all the emissions related to manure management, nitrogen-based emissions. There's usually bigger farms, more than 100 cows, have liquid or slurry manure management. Smaller farms handle solid manure, which also affects emissions. And there's different percentages of like collection rates of manure during the grazing and the non-grazing season. So we are dividing our model into grazing and non-grazing seasons for each region in order to capture those differences in terms of diets and management practices better. And at the end, we present the yearly average based on the number of months that the region has. Like I mentioned before, these two graphs just show an example in New England of, that's the composition of the dairy ration per animal type. So in the right here in blue, most of the feed is coming from pasture. Right, there's more supplementation for lactating cows, corn silage and corn grain and other supplements. We're talking about there's some soybean meal, some molasses, mostly molasses, I would say. And there's some vitamins, some kelp, etc., that we're taking into consideration. And then in the non-grazing season, mostly relying on forages, but also there's corn grain supplemented. Okay, so this graph here shows a summary of the results in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for New England. For example, where here I'm presenting non-grazing and grazing and the average. Then my next slides, I think, just have the average. But just to give you an example of that, there are some difference between, non-grazing and grazing seasons. But a couple of things that I want to highlight. First, look at enteric methane in green here. That's more than 50% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions at the farm level. That's an important part. Imagine if the strategies that André was talking about were consistent among dairy farmers. We're talking about 30% reduction of methane could significantly bring down the farm level emissions. Not only in organic farms, right, but in all farms, dairy farms in the US, but organic farms, perhaps enteric methane represents a higher percentage here because since they use less inputs, less resources, right, at the end, that methane is going to become a more important part in their overall emissions. Some other things to point out here, that the N2O emissions from during the grazing season consistently here, it's here in blue and dark blue, a little higher than during the non-grazing season. And this is completely related to there's more pasture right? More pasture in the diet, more crude protein, more nitrogen in manure, more opportunity for that nitrogen to be emitted as N2O and ammonia. And then we're keeping track of ammonia as an indirect source of N2O emissions. Also in gray here, manure collection and storage. This basically in the farms that have bedded packs. This is important because non-grazing season, cows are on the barn, so they require more bedding in bedded packs, and those conditions, which is bedding there, it maintains for long periods of time, high temperatures. There's a mix of urine and manure, so the ideal conditions for N2O to happen, mix of aerobic and aerobic conditions, etc. So that, for example, is important for these two farms that have bedded packs. In orange here, very interesting, this farm is the only one in New England that has liquid manure storage. So you can see this orange section, those are methane emissions from the manure storage. Interestingly, despite that there's less manure that is collected during the grazing season because cows spend most of the time grazing, but there's some manure collection versus the non-grazing season. But those grazing months are coincidental with the hotter months of the year. So the higher the temperature, the higher the methane emissions under the storage conditions that we assume. So there's no cover right in the manure, so the storages. And perhaps one of the most interesting things about our study here in blue and in negative, we accounted for carbon sequestration, which is usually absent from dairy LCAs, which is challenging to do with, there are different variables can be done. I'm going to go deep into the methodology later, but in negative, we can see that there's an important, benefit of carbon sequestration in these farms. Okay, so how do our results compare to other LCA studies? Most of the LCA studies have been conducted in conventional farms, conventional meaning feeding grains. And there's many studies, but some of the more recent ones in the US, Rhodes et al. 2021 conducted a national study and divided in different regions as well, with probably like an average of 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. That was their national average, with ranges from 0.7 to 1.5, which are in the range of our study. Here I'm showing in green those results without carbon sequestration, and in blue with carbon sequestration. So most of these studies, all of these studies really didn't include carbon sequestration. So we're comparing against these green numbers here. There's variation in our modeling as well in terms of just from farm to farm in the same region, but also among farms and between regions. Probably this more representative study, this grazing one, that was published in 2020. They evaluated greenhouse gas emissions from grazing practices. So 1.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk for farms that fed only grass. And then you can see the grain effect, what André was telling about in that last question, as you include more grains in the diet. So there's perhaps the majority of that reduction, those reductions coming from enteric methane, right? There's a reduction in enteric methane there. There are other practices as well that are different in those farms that were evaluated here, but enteric methane was a significant contributor. Enteric methane, very important, and also one of the things that I want to highlight from this slide is that really enteric methane is directly related to milk feeding efficiency. that was highlighted in André's presentation as well. But here you can graphically really see that in our model farms, the higher the emissions here in red, the methane, enteric methane emissions, the lower the feed efficiency. And I'm presenting feed efficiency in different ways here. In yellow is milk production versus just gray matter intake from those lactating cows. But also if we correct, fat and protein corrected milk, you can see here in these blue triangles and yellow squares, the difference of those Jersey cows, that they have higher fat and protein. So the fat and protein corrected milk affects results. And then here, the trend, this fat and protein corrected milk versus divided by the DMI of the herd, but overall the trend maintains. So the lower the feed efficiency, the higher methane emissions. In terms of other sources of emissions, energy, for example, energy use is an important one depending on the region. Like I said before, there's a lot of information in this graph here, but just wanted to highlight that what contributes to emissions in one region doesn't contribute that much in another region. For example, in the Midwest, electricity is a main source from those energy-related emissions. Midwest, mostly coal, natural gas. But in New England, mostly renewables. It's not electricity, but diesel, right? It becomes the most important one. There's this here, bolded numbers represented the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that when you compare the Midwest and the New England, there's a reduction in emissions coming from energy from region to region. Also, energy in total, like total energy related emissions vary from region to region. So in the Midwest can be up to 15%, but in the Northwest, like from 4 to 5% of emissions here. Another important source or contributor of emissions, materials in New England versus the Northwest. This graph presents the sources of emissions from materials. Materials is all, remember, all those things that are used on the farm that are imported from somewhere else, like sulfur, lime, gypsum, and also considering here the sorry, I'm gonna, there's I think a microphone that is not muted, so I'm not sure if you're able to hear that.
I am hearing it. I'm sorry, I thought it was something at your end, but yep, there we go.
Oh,
got it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I mean, I can go, but probably you're not hearing me that well.
I did hear the background noise.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. No problem. Thank you. Yeah, so going back to these are all the inputs coming from, outside of the farm. Again, it can be not as important for some regions. In New England, it can be important for those farms, for example, the Amish and grass farms having bedded packs. So in yellow here, more emissions related to that extra bedding. But in the Northwest, 20 to 22%, mostly because these farms here in California, and then again related to that question of transportation, are coming from outside. So in the Midwest and New England, crops are produced mostly on farm. There's some imports in New England, but in the Northwest and California, all of the grains and most of the forages are imported from, forages from within the United States, but grains from overseas. So there's a big impact in terms of transport and even the yields in other countries in order to produce organic crops, which were lower than what we are modeling here in the US. So just a summary, energy and these other material emissions from those are important. and it can go from 3 to 15% and from 4 to 22%. And just a summary, their electricity and energy sources in one region are more important, Midwest and New England, versus the energy embedded in those imported feeds, more important in California and the Northwest. Going into more detail into the N2 emissions after manure application, mostly the nitrogen source in these farms is manure, coming from manure. There's some supplementation in some regions, but mostly manure. As a result, perhaps soil emissions are not as high as with other conventional dairy LCAs, so 2 to 12%. And again, higher in those farms that have more grazing. So this graph here shows just an example of two things here. The difference between N2 emissions in the same farm from non-grazing to grazing season. So these two farms, this farm had 350 lactating cows, Holsteins. This other farm had 150 lactating cows, Jerseys, but overall higher N2 emissions during the grazing season. And also this farm here had 9 months of grazing. So that was our longest grazing season. So overall, if you compare this other farm that had 4.5 month grazing months, you can really see how that affects N2 emissions because of how we are estimating those N2 emissions from excreted manure and applied manure, excreted on pasture manure. N2 emissions during the storage of manure in the barn, not as high, except for those farms with bedded packs. And this is especially true during the non-grazing season because cows spend, more time in the barns rather than grazing. Again, those bedded packs are just create the necessary conditions for N2O to be emitted. And I'm going to try to go a little faster here because I'm realizing I have 7 minutes, but manure, methane emissions from manure management already kind of like covered these, important in those farms with liquid manure storage. Here in California, not so much in these 150 Jersey cows because they have 9 months of grazing, so not much manure going into the storage pond. Okay, so reaching the carbon sequestration part, we included carbon sequestration with these 5 steps, really. First, account for the carbon that stays on the soil, above and below ground. Above ground, any residue from leftovers of harvesting. Below ground, from the roots that stay and like the residue in the roots, and then from carbon in manure. Then we apply the ratio in terms of the conservation practices that was adopted, that were adopted in these farms. Like there's any rotational grazing, there are cover crops, there are sustainable practices that are not capturing this carbon, but others outside of this carbon that reaches the land from IPCC. And then we applied we used the outputs of a carbon model, the C-tool model that assesses different aspects of the carbon reaching the land, but it really has an effect. They relate the carbon potentially sequestered really on temperature, so that's going to affect our carbon sequestration numbers from region to region. And just highlighting here that below ground residue is very important for organic farms that use more grass, more pasture system, because of the root system that the pasture has. This is the root and shoot. This table here presents the root and shoot ratio of some of the crops used in our farms. 1 point, so almost 2 times the height of the roots versus the pasture that stays above ground versus like 0.18 for corn grain. So there's more carbon that's stored below ground. Here just some of the equations that we use for the above and below ground. Below ground, really considering the root growth at the year of establishment, and then any exudate and secretions from the roots, and then the little hairs that die. So this is all taken from models available in the literature published there, all these rates. Carbon in manure, just a mass balance of consumed carbon in the diet, for lactating cows, carbon that goes in the milk, minus, and the eructated carbon, for other animals as CO2 and CH4, and the carbon that stays in the animal. So the difference goes out in the manure. The conservation practices they are taken from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You're not familiar with that, but they have a nice, table, the different tables of these conservation practices and how they can affect the permanence of carbon in the soil. Either they can promote it or they can, promote the emissions of carbon. So this was applied based on our practices and what information provided by Organic Valley and their farms, what type of conservation practices were used. So they used tillage, for example, if they had rotational grazing, what other inputs they had on their land. Is it like a long-term cultivated crop, like corn grain, continuous corn grain, or if it's rotated, or it's a perennial crop. So all these things affect the carbon stock at the end. And then we apply the carbon sequestration. This paper, Peterson et al. 2013 presents the methodology. We consider 100 years for the carbon sequestration potential to match our LCA, but also because carbon that stays in soil takes a long time to be emitted again as CO2. So there's emissions happening and more emissions happening in hotter and more humid regions than in colder regions. So overall, very important below ground, for organic farms, accounting for that carbon below ground in the roots. Manure is also a very important carbon source. And overall, in our model and between our regions, we had a 7 to 20% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so I'm gonna perhaps leave these 2 minutes for any questions, because here I'm presenting some of the assumptions. I'm just gonna go super quickly, but I told you about based on what you use or what your assumptions, your results as a modeler are going to be different. So nothing related to the actual practices in the farm, but what type of functional unit you use, what type of equation you use to estimate the enteric methane. So we kind of did an initial analysis of that. For example, here we use 4 different enteric methane equations, and we saw that there's an impact in the overall estimation, of enteric methane, even though the trend stays the same. But this is important, like for studies like this that want to start with a baseline. So what is that baseline? What equation are you using? How is that gonna affect your results? And these are the results for like functional unit. Instead of using fat and protein corrected milk, this is the trend of the like 2 farms in each region. But if you use land area here in yellow as your functional, your denominator, or if you use number of animals in the farm, your trend's changing significantly. So like the Amish farm here, which is probably the one that, this farm here, the Amish farms that have the highest emissions now with these other functional units don't look that bad. So there's different functional units that show different efficiencies, right? That we need to consider. And we also did, like we evaluated 14, I think, different management practices and how that can reduce emissions. Milk yield overall, our functional unit has consistently, if we increase the milk production as our denominator, then our intensity is gonna reduce, highlighted by André's presentation as well. Interestingly, those practices tackling manure for those farms that had liquid manure storage were very effective, bringing down emissions. And for our Amish farms, I didn't mention that, but Amish farms, they don't use grid electricity. They use diesel generators for electricity. So even though they have a significant benefit of not having tractors and having horses, then the emissions from the diesel electricity generation are super high. So if they are able to install a renewable energy system in their farm, then they have a potential to significantly reduce their emissions. Okay, so sorry, I was a little, I had to run a little bit, but with that, I'll have to finish the presentation and yeah, open up to some questions. I see that there are some in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Horacio. It's really important information for folks here, so we appreciate your time and thoroughness. And again, if folks have questions, and I'm sure Horacio has his email up there, and I'm sure you can email additional questions as well. So you see the first question about manure management practices that have been most effective for emission reduction. You talked about those a little bit, but maybe you can summarize.
Definitely. And we saw that for manure management, and manure management, I'm just tackling the barn and storage. And most of the, like the application is of manure, sometimes like mostly related to crop production because used as a fertilizer source. But in terms of storage, that's a problem when you have liquid or slurry storage. So there's methane happening. So any practices tackling that, and here I wanted to point out again this graph here. If you put a cover in your manure storage, right? So you're gonna have an interaction with the emissions. You're gonna be able to reduce your emissions. But if you also put like a cover and then you seal that and then you flare that methane that you capture, not even like use it, but just a cap and flare system where you cover your storage. It's anaerobic. You can capture that gas and flare it. You're converting that methane into CO2 that is biotic at the end, and then it converts it to the, so it'll be kind of like accelerating. You remember André had this 10 years of the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. You're just doing it in a very, quick time here. You're converting methane into CO2 and turning it back into the atmosphere. So that's also a very effective strategy to reduce emissions from methane emissions from manure storage.
Hey, there was a question about tools. Yeah, asking about the Cool Farm tool, or just, what's a good tool for a farmer to actually use to try and get a baseline?
That's a very good question. So I haven't heard of this Cool Farm tool. It'll be interesting, but there's the IFSM integrated farm system model. It requires many inputs though. But it's very precise. So I've been using that. There is the Comet tool from USDA that is publicly available. There is also the Farm ES. I'm not sure if it's already publicly available, but the US Dairy Innovation, the US Dairy Innovation Center has a tool, Farm ES. It's called Farm Environmental Stewardship. They have this tool and being kind of like surveying farms across the US in order to get a baseline. And there is also one last one that I want to talk about is the GLEM from FAO, Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They have GLEM, GLEM tool that is also perhaps a little more friendly to use.
Great. If you have solid manure, you can compost, and that has a reduction in greenhouse gases and can be low cost to implement. I guess that's a comment.
Yeah, so
we have a comment back.
Yes, so there is a trade-off with compost. We have to include compost as a more studied practice in our next phase, but we saw that indeed there's a reduction in methane emissions, but there was also, depending on the compost strategy that you're using, active aeration or non-active aeration, etc. based on evidence, from the IPCC, and this is something that needs to be, that we need to look for other sources and other studies that actually measure N2 emissions from the composting processes. But there's a trade-off, as there could be higher N2 emissions. So at the end, the benefits are a little negated, and also the indirect effect of ammonia emissions. If it's actively aerated, you're going to have the ammoniacal nitrogen volatilizing to the air, which has an indirect effect of N2 emissions as well. So there's a trade-off indeed, but it's a strategy that can be used. And then on top of greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to have a useful or more valuable product, right, that can be used to the farmer, for the farmer.
Well, just to follow up on that, related to compost, then how do bedded packs fare poorly, if I understand this correctly? I think you probably just answered that a little bit.
Yeah, and then coincidentally, those farms with bedded packs also are the farms with the lowest milk production. So if you see here on the top, this number 17, that's the fat and protein corrected milk in these two farms versus like 23 on the other farms. So one is overall the emissions are higher because of lower milk production levels, which is our denominator, and then the intensity, right, it's higher. But yes, the bedded packs also have these emissions from N2O. If you see the relationship of all these box or these emission sources, this is different because of the N2 emissions happening in the barn from the bedded packs. And those are the two reasons why these two farms, in general have higher emissions because of low milk production levels, but also the bedded packs here and N2 emissions.
Great. Would applying compost instead of manure onto pasture reduce field N2O emissions?
That's a good question. So one of the things that we are in this study right now, the emission factor, the IPCC, and there's a conflicting literature here. There's the IPCC and other studies that found that if manure is excreted directly on the pasture because of the high concentrations of ammoniacal nitrogen in the urine and the mix with the organic nitrogen in the feces, then that interaction results in more N2 emissions than if you apply that a stable concentration. We didn't account for that here in this study. We're saying no, they're really and based on recent evidence of other studies that really measure N2 emissions from pasture systems. But so the question was, if you apply composting, well, there's a benefit perhaps of applying a more stable amount of compost. You're controlling that instead of just the cow depositing the manure on a specific place in terms of your emissions, and then you're going to have perhaps less volatile nitrogen because of the composting process where you lost it. In other words, we'll have to model that. That's a very, very interesting question, but there's some emissions that are going to happen during the composting processes that overall, if you consider the entire thing, not only the land application part, it's going to be a trade-off. I wouldn't know how to answer that directly, if yes or no, but
great. Still a lot of questions to answer.
That's good.
Seems like, yeah. Okay, well, I think.
Well, let me put my email here. Oops. Did I stop sharing?
Yeah, well, sort of.
No, but okay, sorry. So I'm gonna just put my email here in the chat.
Thank you. Great. So everybody gets a chance to grab that email. I'm sure you'll get a ton of questions. And now I'm supposed to put up our There we go. I'm going to put up the QR code for folks that need CCA credits, and thanks everyone for staying on a little bit longer. I know it was really worth it to me, and Horacio, it was really great to meet you, and hopefully we can keep working on all of this together. It's just feels like the start of it as we try to help farms reduce emissions, especially here in Vermont, where that's going to be a requirement. I'm sure it is everywhere, not just here, but we definitely appreciate your work, and thanks for sharing it with us. And,
thank you for the invitation, Heather, and thanks everyone for staying.
Yes, it was great. We probably should add 2 separate webinars, but we know that people want more, so we'll be circling back around. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And hopefully we'll see you Friday when we hear from Glenda Pereira, the new dairy specialist here in Maine. All right, everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.